All right, welcome to the Backyard Professor live sessions of videos. I have on my show tonight Barry Richins, world traveler extraordinaire, highly sought after educator, and overall fantastic guy who has had a faith crisis like so many of us has, and he has been exploring the various kinds of lands that the Book of Mormon is supposed to have existed in. And we're going to talk about his experiences. So let's get this show on the road. All right. Hopefully that sound adjustment was a little bit better for those of you who have your earplugs. I'm slowly figuring out all this electronic guru technical crap. I'm getting there one way or another. I do have a couple of new podcasts on at the backyardprofessor.org. Don't forget to subscribe to that one and listen in on some fun stuff. I'm trying to keep those to about a half an hour to 40 minutes. I am exploring the nature of the interesting, weird, enigmatic, sometimes contradictory, and ever fascinating world of Mormon doctrines of deity. And so that's kind of a fun one for me. I will be doing some live sessions also on the first vision. I'm working hard on preparing a good slideshow for the first vision that I should have here in just a couple of weeks. So without any further ado, let's bring in my guest, Barry Richins. Barry, how are you tonight?
Hey, Gary, I'm just fine. Thank you.
Good. So here we are, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and yet we can talk just like we're in each other's front room.
That's nothing. When I was a kid, we could talk across the backyard with string and cans.
With the little wire, the string.
Just the little string was the vibrator.
Yeah, we always had trouble when we go around the bushes. It would stop the vibration.
Sure would, wouldn't it? That's how old I am. I remember that those were the things we wanted to play with. That's because that's all we had to play with.
Yeah, well, I'm not too far behind you, but just remember we're getting better, not older. So we're going to talk about.
I'm heck with it. I don't need the hat.
Oh, you look great with your hat.
Heck with it. I'll put it on.
Oh, you either way you want.
That's my professorial hat.
There you go. Yes, you're professorial. Now you are actually, you have been for your entire life involved in education, haven't you? Tell us a little bit about your educational background.
Well, I just barely made it out of high school, and I got to carry my transcript to the college where I was applying because I was late, and so the lady just put my transcript at the high school, put my transcript in, and didn't lick it closed. And so when I got somewhere where I could stop, I found myself on the transcript, and we had a class of 500 at Scottsdale High School, but I was 250. That'll give you an idea, and your viewers an idea of what kind of man I was in education up until that time. But I went to ASU and I took Spanish and couldn't understand it whatsoever. So I got a D the first semester and an F the second semester. But I was in a U.S. history class, and the teacher came in one day and he said, "I'm taking a group of students to Mexico City, here from ASU, to Mexico City, where we're going to study the history of Mexico and the art history of Mexico." Well, I wasn't getting along too well with my girlfriend, so I thought, I got to get out of here. And so I worked up and found enough money to pay my tuition, and I went to Mexico City to summer school, Carrie. And while I was there, I, as studying the history of Mexico, I was listening to a fellow, one of Cortez's lieutenants, talking about fighting the Aztecs, and he said one of the things we would do is we'd use our horses to scare them and to rear on them, and evidently some of them might have taught their horses to fight. And then he said, and we had steel, and all they had were clubs with obsidian in them. And if you ever got cut by one of those pieces of obsidian, it's as sharp as a razor, but you can't really stab anybody with one of those clubs. So I learned. My professor said there were no horses in pre-conquest America.
What?
And there was no steel. And so I thought, that makes sense. And I believed him. He had a PhD. He was a legitimate scholar. And so then I got home from summer school in Mexico, and a few months later, my bishop called me in and said, "Barry, would you like to go on a mission?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Any place you wouldn't like to go?" And I said, "Yeah, Mexico. I've been there." And and then he said, "Well, okay." So when I got my call was to Mexico, northwest Mexico, right on the border of Arizona and California, that area. But when I started reading the Book of Mormon, which I'd never read before, couldn't get on in it, when I started reading in the Book of Mormon, I found out that in the Book of Mormon, there was a mention of horses and a mention of steel.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, who do I believe? Do I believe my religious leaders, or do I believe my academic leaders? And well, I was seriously had a desire to be a good missionary, and so I said, well, I'm going to accept the fact that there were horses here and steel here. And then I put the academic facts up on the shelf. And I kept thinking a lot about it. But you got to have questions to be educated, Carrie. If you don't have a question, it means you don't want to know something or learn something. So when I got home from my mission, I started reading about every Mormon book I could find that talked about steel and horses.
Yeah.
I found out a new word that really fits. It says pseudo-archaeologists, people who think they know something about archaeologists, but don't know a damn thing. And so I remember reading all that stuff and all of these weird ideas about Mormon archaeology. And while I was doing that, Carrie, I decided to go to college, but now I decided I couldn't be that slacker. You want to talk about a lazy learner? Russell Nelson keyed me in when he talked about lazy learner. My first experience in college, I was the laziest of the learners.
I was too.
I got 4 D's and a C, and the C was an accident. But I decided that I wanted to be something. And I tried to get into a biology class, but it was closed. And so I thought, what else? And I saw Russian offered. So I took a Russian class. And kind of a funny thing, the teacher wore a corduroy suit, probably had leather on his elbows, and he had a tie in a one knot Windsor, so it kind of bent a little bit to the side, and he wore penny loafers. And I remember sitting there in that class looking at him. I say, "That's how I want to learn to dress." And I thought, and I want to be a college professor someday. That just hit me. The idea hit me, and so I kept going to school, and finally I got a bachelor's degree in Spanish, but I finished instead of ASU, I finished at Northern Arizona. Then from where I minored in Latin American studies and majored in Spanish, and I went out to the University of Iowa, and I was a teaching assistant there, and I got to teach. And one time one of my major professors said, "I want all you graduate students to know that just like people in football players take big pride in playing in the Big Ten, I want you to know that you can take big pride in teaching in the Big Ten." And I thought, well, that's neat. But I'm going to tell you something. I had a class at Iowa. It was the hardest class I ever took. Probably the reason why my Levi's don't fit to this day. I think I worked my butt off. Carrie, it was so hard because it was advanced grammar and composition, but it was all in Spanish. I didn't even know advanced grammar and composition in English. So even though I understood every word he said and could hear everything, and the guy lectured in Spanish, of course, and sure. But I didn't know the translation. And so the second semester, it was a 6-hour course, and the second 3 hours, I got a C. Well, in college, C's in graduate school, C's like an F.
Yeah.
And so I said to myself, "Dang, I'm going to work like hell. I'm going to have to work really, really hard." Yeah, baby, whatever.
Yeah, baby. Mark Crispin's going to love you now.
Anyway, I worked really hard through summer school, and it finally started making sense to me, came to me, and I got an A in the course, and I transferred out of Iowa and went back to BYU, and they hired me to be a teaching assistant there. And
so what year was that you were at BYU?
69 through 72. Okay. Around that time. Anyway, when I got to BYU, I could teach Spanish 101, 102. I could speech 220, some of the intermediates between that. And then I could teach advanced grammar and composition. The difference was just a year when I couldn't have taught that ever before. I could always speak Spanish well, but I didn't know very much about the insides and outsides. And I had to become an expert. And that class was the hardest class I ever took. But it really helped me because Carrie while I was at BYU, they chose me to teach in their semester abroad in Spain.
Oh, really? Oh, how cool. Well, that works out perfect then. Now you get to go over to Europe.
I did. And we were there for a whole semester, and I loved it. And while I was in, I'll come back to my education later, but something happened in Spain. While I was in Spain, a friend of mine from BYU was who was full-time faculty and had to publish every year or every 2 years, whatever it was. He needed a subject to write about, and at that time, the Man of La Mancha, the musical, was a big thing, and the Mancha's right in the heart of Spain, and all it means is a big old spot. Like if you drop coffee on your shirt, that's you say, me Manche, I got a big spot. And so I said, why don't you write about that? We can do an agricultural investigation of the region.
Uh-huh.
And we went to all kinds of government offices and all kinds of places. Then one day we decided to go down into La Mancha and get to know it. And as we were going through a little town called Madridejos, up to our right, up on a hill, we could see a castle.
I've got a picture of that castle. Hang on.
Okay.
You keep talking. I'll get the picture.
anyway, and I could see that castle.
There we go.
There it is, guys, right there. That was a Roman castle, and it was built before Christ was born. It was a AC, or what would we call before the Common Era castle, and then next to the castle we saw a bunch of windmills, and these windmills that you can see here, these are modern windmills, and there was a fellow there, an old man, who had been imprisoned in the Spanish Civil War because he's on the Republican side and they lost. But he was one of the few people left in Spain who could build a windmill from the ground up. And so he built all these windmills, and these windmills, then the country of Spain would sell these windmills, and on the doorstep of each windmill, it would say, donated by the people of Luxembourg to keep the memory of Don Quixote alive.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really kind of neat, Care. And he took me inside and he let me crawl all over, and I could see all the wooden beams and all the wooden cogs that we had carved. And he told me that I said, so what's that castle over there, and why are you building these windmills here? And he said, well, the castle was on the hill because below the hill, and it was a big hogback hill. I think it went up maybe 200 or 300 feet tall, and then it went across, just straight across, and at the bottom of the hill, the Romans had a camp, and the Romans couldn't live in Spain very easily. They had to keep legions there because Spain became the granary of the Roman Empire. And it also provided a lot of the horses for the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But the Romans, when the people who lived there were called Celtiberos or Celtiberos, because Iberian Peninsula and stuff like that. And they would come after the Romans every once in a while, and then the Romans would have to go up into the castle while the enemies, the rebels, were laying that siege.
Yeah.
And I went in. He said, "Would you like to go into that castle?" And I said, "Oh man, yeah." He said, "It's not open to the public." He said, "No one comes here but a few archaeology students out of Madrid, and they work a little here and there." He said, "But I have a key to the door." And he went over there with a skeleton key and opened this little door. It was inside of a big wooden door, and we went in, and it was the masonry was absolutely beautiful.
Oh,
And the guy said, "This castle was built before the time of Christ, and the Romans came up here, like I just said, when they were in danger, when the rebels were attacking their big camp below." And then I said, "What about the windmills?" And he said, "Well, the Romans built windmills here, and if you'll go back to that windmill picture, I don't know if you can see it very well, but in some places here, all that was left was the foundation of old windmills. So they were at least 2,000 years old." And he said that the Romans, since Spain had so much grain and wheat, grain, the Romans would bring grain up there so that they could feed the people in the camp. And they had he said there were 15 foundations here. He said, so with those 15 windmills, they could grind about 5,000 tons. Was that 500 tons of, no, not tons, 500 pounds, or maybe 2,000 pounds of grain a night, because they needed it for their bread.
Those are pretty big operations. So yeah.
It was. And so he told me, he told me some really interesting things about the castle, but it doesn't have anything to prove what I want to say. But he said,
this was built before Jesus.
It was built before Jesus.
Yeah.
And in the 10th century, if you've ever heard of El Cid, the famous Spanish warrior,
Oh yeah.
His only son, which is not mentioned in the poem of El Cid, was killed there in defense of the castle 1,000 years before I got there. And then he said, so he told me all about this. And then So my friend and I really learned a lot that day about Roman archaeology and
Yeah.
Roman anthropology. And so a couple of weeks later, I I was with some of my students from BYU, and we were in a place called Merida. If you ever heard the word emeritus, it means those who have retired. So Merida, one that is retired. Merida, I found an amphitheater like the Greeks used to use and the Romans used, and I had my students sit on the seats, on the stone seats, and I talked to them a little bit, and they could hear me perfectly. And then just over the hill from the amphitheater was a miniature coliseum. They called it a circus because they're round from circle, and that's where the word circus comes from.
Circus. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and they had that was where they used to have gladiator fights, lion fights, animal fights, and all that kind of stuff. And I realized that the Romans were ubiquitous in Europe. After being in Spain for a semester, all of us got to travel for 3 weeks through Europe. And just about everywhere I went in Europe, there'd be some reminder that the Romans had been there.
Oh.
Yeah. And so what I want,
yeah, so that's a very important concept that helped lead you to your faith crisis, isn't it?
well, it did. But you know, Kerry, the funny thing about this is I'm 81 right now. And I left the church only 6 years ago. I guess 7 years now. I left in, I think in, well, maybe six, might have left in 16. But the thing was, after being in Europe, I came home and I went to graduate school. I finally went to college and graduated, and then went to graduate school. So I started graduate school at NAU in Northern Arizona University, and then I went to Iowa. Then I went to Brigham Young, and then I went to Illinois State, and then I went to ASU, Arizona State. And I completed enough courses and enough graduate work to have the equivalent of 2 masters and a specialist. And so when I went to work here at the college, at Northland Pioneer College, where I taught for 41 years, I was able to, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, to be employed, I had to get a license. I had to get a certificate, and so I was certified in Spanish, English, and reading. And so my degree was perfect for me for teaching in a community college, and I really loved it. And at the community college, Kerry, I taught Spanish and English and reading.
Yeah.
And that so that if there weren't enough courses for me in one area, they'd always find another one for me in another area. But what was so wonderful about knowing all of these things is I had a buddy who married a Mexican girl, and he loved Mexico, and so he used to be our main Spanish teacher. I was never a main Spanish teacher. But I was his boss because of I was the head of the languages. And so he would sponsor trips to Latin America, to Mexico. And so Kerry, he took us through all of the major archaeological sites in Mexico. I've been in Palenque, which is a magnificent.
Yeah. Hey, hold on. I've got some. Keep talking. I'm just saying. We'll get all that. There we go. I knew I had a slide that had the temples.
That's Chichen Itza.
Yeah, that's
and I've been all through there. And when I was young enough when I first went that I could go through all of the buildings. So I've been to a place in Oaxaca called Monte Alban. I've been to see the big heads over in Villahermosa, Tabasco, and I think that's the right state. I hope it is. So I've been to Nuevo Casas Grandes and stuff like that. And but before I ever went to start looking at pyramids and things, I once, when I was a graduate student at Illinois State studying for my master's in English, a buddy took me down to Cuba, Illinois, which is on the Illinois River that goes between Chicago and St. Louis. And he that was the first time I had ever heard that there were Indian mounds. And so the mound I visited there was called the Dixon Mounds. Yeah, kind of like that serpent, but only it was a big, it was more like a small pyramid.
Uh-huh.
And so the guys told us, the guy that was the park ranger or whatever said, we've dug in this mound and we've looked at the bones and we've carved 14 of them. And he said, the oldest person we can find in this mound was 40 years old. He was probably the patriarch of the group, indicating that the ancient peoples had hard lives. They would chew themselves to death.
Yeah, 40 would have made him the elder.
Yeah, their teeth would go, and all other things. Even though they had lots to eat, they didn't have anything to soften their grain. So they'd have to grind it up and stuff, and leather and whatever. But so I became interested in ancient American archaeology, and I took a great course on ancient North America. And the professor, the PhD professor, said that all of the people that lived right now you got Cahokia over there in the right-hand corner up.
Yeah, this is another one of the mounds. I put together 3 or 4 different slides of the different areas and mounds. They were all over America, but none of these are identified with any Book of Mormon people that we're aware of yet.
That's what the fellow said. He said, the people who died in these cities and the bones we have found and that are ancient enough to look at, they are the same people. They are related to the people who are alive today. The Native Americans who live in and around that area are the same people as their ancestors were 1,000 years before or 2,000 years before. And so there was no evidence ever that there was such thing as as a Lehite civilization. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit, unless you want to ask me a question. But when you finish, I'd like to go on with what I learned about comparing the Roman civilization to that of the Lehite.
Oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. By the way, RFM says hi. You remember him?
I do remember him. He's one of the best people I've ever met that I've never seen.
Me too.
But I love RFM, and I think he's probably
don't tell him that. It'll swell his fat head.
RFM, I used to teach English, and I used to teach argumentation, and I was a novice compared to you. I'm not kidding you. And when I hear you take an argument apart, I think, damn, I wish I could do that. The only one I think is probably as good as RFM is that little Nemo kid from England.
He's good, isn't he?
Yeah,
he's fun to listen to too. He just gets right to it, man. When I grow up, I want to be like all these guys, even though I am already their grandfather.
I was sitting there listening to Nemo talk, and I thought to myself, I've taught a lot of bright kids, and it was in my area, it was my responsibility to know things, and I could tell how bright Nemo was early on, but not until he put that argument together the other night was I ever impressed with how bright the young man is. Nemo, if you hear that, contact me sometime, and I'll whisper in your ear something really nice like "good job" or something.
Well, this is one of the interesting things of the crisis within the church, I would think, is
it is.
It seems like all of the bright people, it's like I told Dennis McDonald last night on the show. I said, in Mormonism, they tell you can believe anything at all you want, just shut up about it and don't talk about it. Here in church. And he just laughed like crazy. He said, that is absolutely absurd. And I said, it is. That's why we're all coming to the YouTube, because if you don't want us talking about it in church, we're going to talk about it here. So I wanted to tell you what I learned in Spain. When I
when I went around Spain, I saw old Roman ruins. I even went to a church that was built in 1600, a Christian church.
Mhm.
But that was when the Visigoths came in and took over Roman possessions in Spain. But
Right.
I saw evidence of the Roman civilization everywhere in Spain. Everywhere, I mean, all over. When I went to Italy, when I was in a salt mine near Salzburg. That's where the word salt comes from, salt. And
So
the Romans had a big old mine there called the Heartland salt mines. Then when I went over to Germany, I was at the Cologne, the cathedral, and we couldn't go in the front door because when they were working on the foundation of that really old cathedral, they dug into a Roman site, and so
oh,
it was just everywhere. And when my buddy would take me to Mexico and we would go to all of these magnificent archaeological sites, I would go to the museums and we generally always tried to have a really good guide,
mhm.
not a fly by nighter and not a pseudo guide, and I would listen very carefully, and never once did I find any evidence in my mind that would indicate that there had ever been two civilizations in the New World, that there would ever have been a Lehite civilization. Uh,
Oh, interesting.
there
Yeah.
was
Yeah,
no
because all the civilizations built on top of the older ones, didn't they? Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting.
there was no indication anywhere that Nephite civilization existed. And my friends Tom Murphy and Simon Southerton have I've so enjoyed their work on DNA,
Yeah.
and Simon says there's no evidence anywhere in the New World of
No.
of haplogroup X2A, which people try to associate with the Hebrews. The haplogroup is so old that it probably came to the Americas 20,000 years ago, or maybe a little less, or maybe a little before.
Mhm.
And in that haplogroup, it comes out of uh, Central and East Asia, and but it's also found in Europe and in the Middle East. But that's 20,000 years ago. That's long
Yeah.
before the Jews were ever recognized as a people. And
Yeah.
and so when the natives who crossed that Bering Strait came down in boats around there, um, they brought that haplogroup uh, X2A with them. But
Mhm.
according to Simon, there's no relationship between that and the things that they find in Israel, even among the bones in Israel, I guess.
Yeah. I've
So
talked to him about that too, and he's told me the same thing. He keeps up on that stuff quite a bit. I had him on a month or two ago, and he was talking a little bit about Kennewick Man and the horse bones. You wanted to talk about the horse bones. You've studied that stuff a little bit.
remember, I told you that uh, there's no evidence that horses were ever found, modern horses. Horses evidently originated on this continent, and some of them went not back into Europe, but crossed them from another direction and went into Europe. But horses were a big animal and easily recognized and easily snuck up on. And so they think that the hunter gatherer peoples that crossed just killed them off like they killed the elephants and the giraffe,
Mhm.
excuse me, the camel-like animals and the bear and the
Right.
and stuff like that. And so they said they probably last were seen maybe 8,000 BC.
Yeah, 8,000 BC. That's way too early. Yeah.
Or something like that, or 8,000 years ago. But so they said, they discovered near San Luis Potosi in Mexico, I think that was the area, some horse bones.
It was in Mexico. Yeah.
And they checked these bones out and they said, wow, these people existed, these horses existed at the same time that the Jaredites came,
Yeah.
20,
Yeah.
2,500 years before Christ. And the archaeologist who see, one of the things is, guys, if you publish under a scientific name,
Right.
somebody's going to read your stuff and they're going to challenge you. And so
Yeah.
the archaeologist that challenged him said, "Wait a minute." He said, "This was buried in the soil, but there was volcanoes in Mexico, so it put a cover on it, and so the rain would come and percolate out of the volcanic ash and soil and weeds or whatever, and
Right.
it would coat the bones." And he says, "I don't think that is a Book of Mormon horse." He says, "It
Right.
doesn't." He said, although the material that they tested with anyway, the material they tested, they found a much later date, but probably it was buried there, and all of that stuff that percolated
Right.
onto the bones.
Right.
So the only way they'll really know is if they take the marrow.
Yeah, it was contaminated, so you couldn't get they couldn't get the marrow in the bone or the inside of the bone, from what I understood. But
that was kind of a big thing for some LDS people.
and see, that's where the Mormon apologists will try to stop. What they want to say is, oh, look, bones in the same time slot. That's all we want to know about. When in fact, it wasn't the bones that was in the time slot. It was the contamination that came down onto the bones. It doesn't help, but they don't want to see that full context if it's faith promoting.
Well, the same thing with the same thing with Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man, they think was buried about 9,000 years ago. But sometime about 3 or 4,000 years after he was placed in the soil, there was a volcanic eruption near there, and all of the ash covered that, and so they had a lot of contamination from the rainwater.
Exactly.
So, some guy wrote a book, kind of the face of a Lehite or something like that, and another pseudo archaeologist.
Yeah,
and he said that or the writer said, it's impossible. He said all of that contamination was from the groundwater that seeped into the bones, and but the bones themselves show that he's maybe 6,500 years older.
Yeah.
So those are kind of things I hear and I listen to, and I've always been interested. But let me go back to comparing what I knew about the Romans, and I'd had the experience of being there. I had seen it. I had I'd touched it. I touched it. I've climbed around it. I got to climb around in that castle, and so I'd been there. I've taught Virgil's Aeneid, which is a Roman story of their hero, their founding hero, and so when I got home and I was still a Mormon when I came home from my mission. I was still very active and still a believer. And for some reason, I still believed the Book of Mormon was true, but I had all kinds of questions all the time. And the more and more I went to these different Book of Mormon, quote unquote, sites, I started thinking, there's no evidence that any other society lived here.
Right.
And that didn't appear to me that there was any conspiracy to try to keep it a secret. I would have thought that if the Mexicans had found out that there had been a white race there that lived alongside the dark race, they would have been happy and proud to say, geez, look at this. We have evidence of these people there. But so I don't believe there was ever a conspiracy to hide it. But you've probably seen that joke. You open up a book and it says Book of Mormon Museum, and then you open it up and there's nothing there. Because my friend Michael Cole, whom I really respect, and I've never met him, but I've listened to him on John DeLynn, and I've really liked him, and I've read what he said in dialogue. But he said that there is no evidence in or on the ground anywhere that another civilization existed. We've never found writing, not even what do we call the Egyptian shorthand Egyptian with the. What did Joseph Smith call it? The Book of Mormon is fully written in. And we've never found writing on stones or in caves. Oh, there's writing been found and claimed to be ancient,
Right.
but those were mostly hoax, as far as we know.
Yeah.
And
It's unfortunate, but that's true. Yeah.
yeah, and there were lots of people saying, well, there's some type of something going on here. There's a conspiracy. People don't want to know about the Lehite, the Lehite civilization. But we've never found anything anywhere. I mentioned that castle because evidently the Lehite people made a temple, and out of stone is as the one in Jerusalem, and they
And we've
also,
still got a lot of those temples to this day.
yeah. And when I
But
went to
these are Mesoamerican ones.
yeah, and when I went to let's see, I just lost my train of thought again. Uh, anyway, they made temples and other stuff. And when I went to the windmills, that's what I was going to say. At the windmills, they had built a structure that they had used, and it was functional, and we still had the foundations that were Book of Mormon times, and we've never found anything like that at all. And so that really helped me. But I kept following my education, and I taught for 41 years at my local college here. But about the time I was finishing, in the last 5 or 10 years, in my world lit classes, I had to teach Old Testament and New Testament. And Gary, what was interesting about that is I didn't feel much like a scholar of that. I'm a scholar in Spanish and a scholar in English, but those are my areas of expertise. Otherwise, I'm just almost a pseudo intellectual, a pseudo scholar. But the fact is I do like to read and learn things. And so I did some really deep dives on the Old and the New Testament. And and all of a sudden, I started doubting the scriptures at all. And then I started doubting the existence of God. And today, I don't like definitions much, but probably if you were to ask me if I'm an agnostic or an atheist, I'd say I'm an agnostic because that means you don't know either way. I don't know if it's right or I don't know if it's wrong, or God exists or doesn't. But I would say that I'm probably an agnostic leaning towards atheism. And
that's kind of where I put myself at this point. Yeah. I'm seeking, I'm willing to see all sides and listen to all voices and views and test and compare. I mean, that's fun. That's what I've been doing my whole life, whether I was a believer or not. So I continue doing it because I love to learn too, just like you do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so pretty soon, one day, I'd never been on the internet ever. I had a computer in my office and I used it all the time for my schoolwork. But I've never been on the internet until my cousin sent me something, and he says, "Go to this site, and there's a really interesting little faith-promoting story." So I looked at that site, and that wasn't very cute or inspiring to me. But up on the top of that site, I saw a place said, two young men go to visit an archaeologist. Or two Mormon young men go to visit an archaeologist. And so I listened to it, and they said, "Can you tell us a little bit about the archaeology of the Book of Mormon?" He said, "There is no archaeology of the Book of Mormon."
Pretty gutsy missionaries, I'll tell you.
It's a nine shicer for sure. And what happened is my mind, all of a sudden, it was a eureka moment, Carrie. I have a doctor named Terry. Anyway, it's a eureka moment, Carrie. And what happened to me is I went, "That's true. That's true." And within maybe a month's time, I'd resigned from the church. And the last thing I was waiting was for the Book of Mormon to be true. So the Book of Mormon started my shelf. But I didn't leave the church just because of the Book of Mormon. I left the church because I was dying of 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
A little question here, a little doubt here, all of that stuff, you know.
And isn't it fascinating that even with a church of Revelation, they couldn't put band-aids on all those cuts and heal you? They just don't seem to have answers to a whole lot of much of anything.
Well, you know, Kerry, now that I've been out of the church for about 6 years, and I wouldn't say I lost my faith. I would say I discovered reason. And what I meant by that is I had to tell myself, cognitive dissonance is a bad thing, son. It messes you up. You can't have two ideas that are contrary to each other.
That's true.
Be healthy mentally, and especially ones that are part of your life lie. And so I just realized that I had to accept evidence. Now, as a college professor, Kerry, I used to teach my students. I'd say, "Hey guys, when you have a question or you're going to argue something, you got to figure out what it is you want to argue. But you can't argue anything unless you study about it, and until you understand both ideas, both sides. And then you have to examine both sides. And if you had a continuum, say about 100 inches, maybe you could meet in the middle somewhere and to get together. But you had to know the facts. You had to look at the evidence. And if you weren't willing to look at the other person's evidence as well as your own, you weren't academically healthy. And so I taught my students to do that, to look at it all before they ever started a counter argument or whatever it is. But all of a sudden I realized, Barry, you're a hypocrite. You're not doing that about your church. You're not looking at Carrie, I don't know anything about anybody else's church. On my mission, I met a lot of Catholics and a few Protestants, but I never attended their church. I go to church once in a while with one of my friends to mass, but I never knew anything about Catholicism. I never knew anything about being a Baptist or of an evangelical of any type. Didn't know. Right. And I'd say, I know that this is the true and only church, but I was never willing to look at the other side of the evidence. And yet I had always been a skeptic, and in college I was a skeptic, and on my other courses I had to follow reason. So when I finally left church, what happened to me is that I decided that if I were going to be honest with myself, I had to look at reason. I had to be an empiricist. I had to look at evidence, and I had to weigh it, and I had to weigh one side against the other side so I could make some kind of decision along that continuum. And so that's what happened to me. That's why I got so interested in Book of Mormon studies. And
isn't it interesting? Sorry to interrupt you, but isn't it interesting that Joseph Smith actually tried to set the church on that trail when he said, by proving contraries, truth is made manifest. And yet today's church is absolutely terrified of inconsistencies, of change, of exploring any other option. The internet's got to be their worst nightmare for that reason. You say you discovered reason. Joseph Smith is the one that tried to put reason into them, and they've refused. That's interesting, isn't it?
Well, Joseph is an interesting fellow.
He is, yeah.
He's a contrast in of himself. But the fact is if you don't have questions, you don't have contraries. You know, you only believe one thing. And so if you believe only one thing, you're not very intellectually honest. And especially when it comes to being a member of a certain church. And so when I started looking at the evidence, deeper and deeper evidences, and here's what I realized. Here's a conclusion I made out of realizing that the Book of Mormon didn't exist. I realized, I said, if the Book of Mormon didn't exist, or the Lehite civilization didn't exist, then there was no people for Nephi and Lehi and all the other guys, Alma, to be preaching to. If there's no people to be preaching to, there was no people to be writing either. And if there was no people to be writing, there was no one writing on gold plates.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came to the conclusion that Joseph Smith was nothing more than a con man, a flint-flon man, because he tells us all about a civilization that didn't exist. And you know, Kerry, I've read the Book of Mormon in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, and halfway in Italian. And I only read them in the languages other than English because it's such a boring book to me. And I'd read it another time when President Benson wanted us all to read the Book of Mormon. Well,
I remember that era. Yeah.
Everybody, but I found it was so boring that if I was expected to be a good Mormon, then I'd read them. Then I said, to hell with it. I'm going to neat things about it is I can buy a Book of Mormon for about $1.50, and I can get one in Portuguese and one in English. And then I could buy a Spanish Book of Mormon, and I could buy a French Book of Mormon, and I could buy an Italian Book of Mormon. So I'd have my English on my lap, and then I'd start reading in Spanish. And anytime I came to a section I wasn't having a hard time with, I'd read the English. And I never found the Book of Mormon to be interesting. I read the baptismal covenant that Alma talked about, and I thought that was beautiful. But what I realized was that Joseph Smith used to be an exhorter at many of the revivals and at many of the churches. And so he knew what people were talking about, and he knew all these stories. So I think that most of the time Joseph Smith just put in one of those other preachers' sermon and made it his own. And that's what it appears to me. And
well, I mean, wasn't it Alexander Campbell who said he was a contemporary of Joseph Smith? And he said, oh, heck, the Book of Mormon, it already solves all of the controversies of our own day. So obviously Joseph Smith was interacting with his contemporary environment. I mean, we've got Dan Vogel in the audience, and no one's written as much about that as him. So, yeah, what you're saying makes sense here. Yeah.
Hey, Daniel, good to see you, buddy. But anyway, and so my conclusion was that if there wasn't such a civilization, we've never seen houses or any ruins where people have lived, then there probably wasn't any people. And if there wasn't any people, there wasn't anybody to write the Book of Mormon, and there certainly wasn't anybody to read it, and certainly anybody to pass it on. And so I just came to the conclusion that it was all bunk, and that the writer was Joseph Smith. And if the Book of Mormon, which is supposed to be the keystone of our religion, isn't true, I don't worry about other arguments about what you find in the Book of Mormon. Like, I don't care anything about what do we call it when one line follows the other, what do we, and they said it was from the scriptures. I can't think of the word right now. I'm a little bit foggy tonight. But anyway, I've seen that in other books. So I don't, if the book of, I take it like this, the Book of Mormon wasn't written from an ancient text. And therefore, I don't follow any of the arguments when people get in and say, but look at all these beautiful scriptures, all these messages. I say, yeah, that's easy. Anybody could have written those messages, especially Joseph Smith, because of his interest in the religion. But I said, I don't go into those arguments. And then when people start arguing about the Book of Abraham, and I've studied that very much, and I really appreciate RFM and John DeLynne's interview. Oh, RFM, I can't think of his name.
Robert Rittner.
Yeah, Robert Rittner. And I thought I loved that. I thought I was.
Yeah, that was epic.
I thought, should I be taking notes? But I never worry about that And I never worried.
I actually did take notes, and I ended up doing an entire series myself. That's kind of what launched my YouTube comeback. I did like 18 videos on the papyri in the Book of Abraham, and then Gerardo and John Delin had me go on his show and share what I discovered with it. So yeah, so yes, take notes, young man.
Well, anyway, I never worry about all the other arguments. Like, well, it could be, instead of being a translation, it could be uh, a catalyst.
Right.
I thought, why in the hell did he buy those? He paid what was it, about $2,000 or something like that for those mummies. And I looked that up.
It was $2,500
And I
equivalent.
looked that up, and it was what, $50,000 or $60,000 in today's money.
No, yeah. Well, I can't. Yeah, I think so. I think it was. Yeah.
And he took that money from the poor people of Heartland, people who didn't have much anyway. And so why didn't he just get a hair up his butt and just write it himself, just and tell him that, because he translated the book of John, or that paper that John evidently left hidden in a cave in the old country, and Joseph translated it across 2 continents and the ocean.
Yeah, good point. I had a question someone was asking earlier. Hold on, I took it off. Yeah, Doug Vincent is asking, do we know of any interesting things coming out with the new LiDAR maps that they're making in Central America?
Well, I probably watch the same programs you do, Doug. But yeah, they're finding that some of those cities were covered much more territory than they thought before, and they're finding old buildings and stuff like that. I remember one time I was in Yucatan, and I was going out to find a ruin called Coba, not too far from Tulum, and so as I went through the jungle with my buddy, we found a little road that kind of led up to the pyramid, a path, and along the path there were little humps everywhere. And I later learned that all those humps were small structures that the people had made up, leading to the main pyramid, which was a religious sanctuary built very high. And I climbed up and I looked out through the jungle, and I thought, wow, whoever lived here, worked here, had to really do something for this jungle. And so the jungles, I bet probably, Doug, with the LiDAR, we'll probably find as much again as we have now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The other thing is they've probably, according to the apologists such as Lou Midgley and Dan Peterson, that they have now found Nephite and Lamanite ruins. They're just mislabeling them as Mayan and Aztec.
Well, that, you know as well as I do, that's parallelism. You find a lot of parallels that you say, oh, that could have been in the Book of Mormon. That could have been in the Book of Mormon. But a parallel, it's kind of like, what is it? What do we say? A probability, or a possibility is not a probability.
There you go. Right.
And so it's kind of interesting there. So I when I read all of this other stuff, I don't worry about it anymore, because I said to myself, screw it, Barry. You're just going to get messed up if you keep trying to answer everybody's argument. The conclusion you came to with the Book of Mormon might be good for you, and it could be for other people. If there wasn't a Lehite civilization, then Smith made it up, and if Joseph Smith made it up and tried to sell it, he was a con man. And if he was a con man, he certainly wasn't a prophet of God. And we're not talking about small imperfections. Joseph Smith didn't have a lot of small imperfections. Hell, he had a lot of great big ones, like marrying a girl who's just 2 months or a couple of months short of her 15th birthday.
That's just a mere detail. Come on.
So those things don't bother me anymore. I hear them, and I join in a discussion once in a while, but I just say, the Mormon Church, at my present understanding, is that the Mormon Church is a fraud. Uh, which I've read a lot of, lots and lots of, doesn't mesh with reality. The Book of Mormon.
It's interesting too, Barry, that when I was an apologist, I remember we were in an email list, and several of them, probably a dozen of the apologists, started banding together and combining their research skills on this subject of polygamy. And they asked me to do it, and I said, I'm not going to touch that subject. I'm going to stick with the much more credible subject of the Book of Abraham facsimiles.
Yeah. You know, but one thing I learned about polygamy.
Terrified of the polygamy issue. And now I do not, now that I've read it, now I know why. Yeah.
I think of Brigham Young. And by the way, he's my wife's great grandfather. But I think of Brigham Young and how Joseph Smith snookered him. But one of the things Brigham and the other boys that later became the hierarchy of the Utah church is say, you go ahead and ask that girl. And you know, any man who doesn't have any scruples, even me, and I have a couple, I would have been pleased if someone said, you can have that woman. And it's not a sin. You can sleep with her, you can do anything you want with her, and she's yours. But when after the Mormon church, after the Brighamite church got to Utah, who were the men that had the most wives? The authorities, right?
First presidency, yeah.
And the apostles. And how did they afford those wives? They didn't. Most of them didn't have jobs of their own or way to bring in income. They were sucking off the tit of the church, and that's how they were getting their money. See, my grandfather, my great grandfather was called on a mission. I think maybe in the late 70s, 1870s, and he was married to one woman. But before he left to go on his mission to England, the church made him take another wife. Mm-hmm. And now he's part of the criminal group because there were already marshals in there there's federal marshals in there trying to find polygamists. So the church made my grandfather a liar. And they made him a criminal. Because bigamy was against the law in the United States, no matter where, when, or what. And also, when they put him on the train, he went so far on the train, and then a group of horsemen stopped the train. My grandfather got off, and they rode up around for a while, and they finally picked the train back up further down the line, and they'd ridden away because people knew where the marshals were waiting to stop the train, looking for people like my grandfather.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff was so awful.
Hey, let me tell you a story about my great grandpa that my good friend Flat Pap brought up. While some of yours were forced into polygamy, I believe it's great. I believe it's 4 greats. Peter Schertz, grandpa. He was known as the Daniel Boone of the West. Once they got over into Utah, Brigham was always sending him down to southern Utah to settle Escalante and all of the old southern. He helped settle Las Vegas and all that, right? So he did that for about 20 years and came up north to Salt Lake, and he told Brigham Young, he said, I'm ready to be a polygamist. I'm ready to take another wife. And Brigham Young said, oh, no, Peter. He said, what I want you to do is go down to Arizona and, explore around and settle some. And Peter said, no, I can do this. I want to be a polygamist. I'm ready to be a polygamist. And Brigham Young denied him. He said, no, I'm not going to. And so basically my great grandfather flipped Brigham Young the bird, flipped him off and said, "Kiss
I
my
was
ass,"
really lucky.
and left the church.
Yeah, I met. Did he? Yeah, thank goodness. I met my grandfather, and my mother she was growing up. Used to say, but Grandpa uh, had his farm and ranch in Lyman, Wyoming, and the township of Lyman was his farm and ranch. And the church asked him to give it away to make a town there. So he gave it to the church, and they did all the real estate and all the measuring, and became Lyman, Wyoming. But in this little town of Lyman, my grandfather built a beautiful home on this side of town for one wife, and a beautiful home on this side of town for another wife. And
Yeah.
And they looked just exactly alike. And I'd never known that until about 10 years ago when my mom took me there and told me about it. But she said when she would go to see her grandma, they always called her grandma. But when she would go to see his other wife, they would call her aunt. And I can't remember the name anymore, but my great grandpa had about 20 kids there in Lyman, Wyoming.
I'll be darned. Yeah.
So I met the old man, and I really liked him. And he's about the age I am now when I met him. And I only met him once. He came walking up the street, and he looked like my grandpa.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow. And I got to shake his big, tough man, good-looking old fellow, kind of like me,
Yeah.
But
a lot.
I thought you were going to say he was as good.
Oh yeah, brag. I do. Of course, then nobody believes me when I do. But so what?
So anyway, that was just some of those things that I learned. And as I studied church history, I was so disappointed. And I remember on my mission, I don't think I could have ever testified to the truthfulness of the translation of the Book of Mormon if I had to tell them that Joseph Smith translated it with a rock in the hat. It's not that. If you've noticed, that rock isn't even opaque. You couldn't see light or anything. And so anyway, I can't believe that I would have said, I know, with no doubt that the Book of Mormon is true. And so I'm so grateful that even at 70, I was 75 when I retired. And even at 76. I was 75 when I retired. So that'd been 2016. Anyway, when I retired, I'm so glad that I broke away from the church, and I'm so glad that my experiences in life. I'm kind of Marco Polian, Care. I've lived in 3 countries. I think I've visited 15 foreign countries. I've swum in the Atlantic and in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. I've traveled a lot just by accident. None of it was planned or prepared, but I was curious, and I was a good listener, and so I learned a lot of this stuff. So that when I was ready to leave the church, I was really ready.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And
so you mentioned to me that you had a study that you presented to a group of scholars at a college, about a 5-page study on the ability to use critical thinking.
Yeah.
Would you share some of that with us? I would like to see what you learned in a lifetime of knowing and teaching, and in your travels and all. Distill some of that kind of wisdom to us. That would be very important to hear.
Let me say to those of you listening, I'm going to do some reading because this was a speech I was asked to give at Phi Theta Kappa, which was the education fraternity of the community colleges.
Right.
And so I thought, what would I want them to know? And I thought about critical thinking. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's a really important thing, but you can't just be a critical thinker because you decide to be a critical thinker. You have to have some concepts in your mind. And so I titled the speech, and I'm not going to read it all, but Kerry, if I get boring, just go ahead and sleep more. Okay. He said,
you're never boring.
Things I'd like budding scholars to know. Point one, to be a scholar, you must accept that people have some control over their behavior and to that extent are responsible for their actions. Otherwise, how could you discuss moral issues? Also, you can become motivated to approach problems creatively and critically only if you affirm that people have control over what they say and do. You must believe that careful thinking can make a difference. Second, to be a scholar, it is wise to be open-minded. Not so open-minded that if someone turns you upside down, your brains would fall out, but having an open mind does not mean you don't make judgments, moral or otherwise. Teach yourselves to be willing to look at all sides of an argument before you judge it. Once you have made an honest, well-educated investigation of all the facts, then you can make a judgment and form your opinion. Bear in mind that your opinion is still only an opinion. And remember that sometimes enough information is not available to make judgments and opinions at all. The result of such acknowledgement is that your peers will see you as open-minded and welcome to their world. 3, to be a scholar, you need to know the difference. This is what I really want to emphasize. You need to know the difference between fact and opinion, or truth and opinion. Truth is that which is so about something, the reality of matter, as distinguished from what people wish were so, believe to be so, or assert to be so. No one can become a good thinker without acquiring a mature understanding of the nature of opinion. Okay, it is important to realize that people do not create truth. Yet progress depends on the curiosity and the interest of people, the drive to find the right answer, the desire to know the truth. A theory is an opinion about a subject, and as you know, not all opinions are equally valid. A good theory, like a good opinion, is well thought out, well researched, and well tested. A poor theory is just the opposite. Do theories change? Yes. Does truth ever change? No. The truth will be changed by our knowledge. The truth will not be changed by our knowledge of our ignorance. One way to spare yourself any further confusion about truth is to reserve the word truth for the final answer to an issue. Get in the habit of using the word belief, theory, and present understanding more often. Doing so will have the added benefit of making you more willing to revise your ideas when new evidence appears and cast doubt on them. To be a scholar, 4, you need to learn to make value judgments. Many people say it's wrong to debate moral issues and make value judgments. However, the view is shallow. If value judgments were wrong, ethics, philosophy, and theology would not be acceptable courses in a college curriculum. It is not undemocratic or non-politically correct to challenge expressions of judgments because judgments are only as good as the evidence that supports them.
You ought to repeat that one again. Repeat that one again, would you? That's really important.
Yeah, I think I'll get to it a little bit more. It is not undemocratic or non-politically correct to challenge expressions of judgment because judgments are only as good as the evidence that supports them.
There you go.
Over the course of human history, judgments based either on insufficient evidence or a narrow interpretation of evidence has caused a great deal of problem. For example, we knew about fossils. We knew about huge bones from time immemorial. But when the people would see them, especially among the Christian times, that they would say, "Oh, those were animals that were killed in Noah's flood," or "Those are God's trying to, the devil's trying to trick us." Mm-hmm. And so we never study it. We never would try to get interesting because to be so, do so would go against God and his preachings.
Hey Barry, I'm not trying to interrupt you, but I have a good patron and a good friend, JC. He's saying he loves your talk. Can we get a written copy? You and I need to somehow be, once we're done here, I'll get some written copies of this from, or do you know someplace where they can go to read it or get a copy?
No, I just have one on my computer that I can print out and send to you. I tried to send it through today, and I don't know. I tried two times.
Know. I couldn't get a copy. Otherwise, I would send it to you, JC. But you'll need to get a hold of Barry.
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Talking about judging cultures and stuff like that. For example, if there's a culture where women have no rights and they're treated as second-class citizens, you and I should be able to discuss those things, shouldn't we? And we should be able to make value judgments.
Yes.
What do you think? Here's an interesting story. An old fellow in Brazil, this was in the 19th century, 1878 or something like that. Anyway, this old fellow shot his wife because she went to the zoological garden without his permission. And when they charged him with murder, but the judge said he was only protecting his reputation and his rights as a man. They were challenged by his woman not listening to him and doing what he said. She was guilty, and so they set him free.
Wow.
He was protecting his manhood.
Wow.
And yeah, so don't you and I have to make discussions on such subjects? So we have to discuss those things. Let me read you this. We must make value judgments about our own culture and that of our neighbors in the world. Is it legitimate for us to pass judgment on the moral standards of another culture if we do not honestly, by doing good thinking about the issues? See, wait a minute. Is it legitimate for us to pass judgment on? Let me get some more light on that. Hell, I should have done that for a long time ago.
Yea, or vihi or let there be light.
No, yeah, I as a reading specialist, we must make value judgments about our own culture and that of our neighbors in the world. It is legitimate for us to pass judgment on the moral standards of another culture if we do so honestly, by doing good thinking about the issue, getting beyond generalizations and examining the particulars of a case. For example, we can say that any society that treats any man or woman as inferior or places less value on their lives than the lives of those in power is mistaken and is acting immorally. And so I think that's kind of important. And kind of finishing off here, I like this last one, point 5. Oh, let's see. This goes back to cultural judgment. When you and I treat with prejudice any person who has broken no laws or has done society no harm, we are acting immorally. We can say that, can't we? Wouldn't that be our judgment?
Yeah, good point.
When in Rome, do as the Romans do is kind of shitty. Excuse me. Oh, it's kind of awful if you think about it. And so, but here's the last one. And you know, one of the great things of my travel for me has been, it kills a lot of prejudice. You meet people from everywhere. And if you spend enough time with them, if you don't learn to love them, you learn to really like them. So here's the last one. Okay. Finally, to be a scholar, you must learn to avoid stereotyping. Learn to be a civilized individual human being, and to treat your fellow men as individual human beings as well. The act of stereotyping shows us that there is something in all of us that wants to drift toward a mob, where we can all say the same thing without having to think about it, because everybody is alike except the people we hate or persecute. Every time we use a word to describe others, we're either fighting against this tendency or giving into it. And by giving into it, we become so narrow-minded as a culture that we can end up destroying our civilization. Kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? When we fight,
isn't it though?
When we fight against the tendency to stereotype, we are taking the side of genuine and permanent civilization.
Yeah.
Our civilization is enriched when we choose to weigh the value of each individual. And that was my talk. And
Awesome.
I organized it, but those thoughts are not mine. They're thoughts that I adopted, and thoughts that I respect, and and principles I've tried to live. But I have to thank other scholars who shared those ideas with me. And I just one day went around and said, I've got to give this talk. I know what I want to talk, because I'm talking to the brightest. And I said, what would I like scholars to learn to do? And that's why I wrote that talk. And,
well, thank you for sharing that with us. We may not be scholars of your caliber, but we love the information and we will try to utilize it. So very good.
Kerry, I know what gaslighting is. I'm not a scholar of any caliber. I'm a student.
I gaslight you, Bear?
No. Yeah, as I told my wife, that's a 9 scheisser. She didn't like me saying the other part in English. But I said, the fact is, Kerry, I didn't learn how to do fractions until I was in my second graduate school. I'd missed them in grade school. So I always thought I was dumb. And I always thought I was a fraud being a college professor. But one thing I can do is I listen really well. I observe really well.
Yeah.
And that's always been a blessing to me. And I have a fairly good memory. And fortunately for me, even at 81, I still have my mind, even though I'm feeling a little muddy-minded tonight. It's probably because I'm sleepy. But the fact is, Kerry, I'm not a scholar. I'm a student. And that's all I want to be known as.
There's the key right there. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. When we stop being students, when we get to the point to where we say, well, I know, then you shut yourself off from all knowledge or learning more. Yeah. I love that. Yep.
To be ready to talk to you tonight, I was going to talk to you a little bit about steel, because the Book of Mormon talks about steel. And so to do that, I did some really deep diving here the last 2 or 3 days. And the fact is I'm just grateful that I have a vocabulary so I can understand what I'm reading, and then I can develop concepts. But
right.
And that goes back to something that's really important to tonight's discussion. There's no evidence of smelting, at least in Eastern North America, before the conquest. None at all. That would be the Heartland area and stuff like that. They found we have a lot of pseudo archaeologists in and out of the church, and they'll take any little thing and try to make it into some big thing.
They do. Yeah.
But they've never found. See, when you make iron, which is the precursor of steel and iron are the same thing. But when you make iron, they both melt at about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But to make steel, you have to put so much alloy and other stuff in it, like carbon. You have to put charcoal and you have to have really, really hot fires with a lot of air to melt them. Then if you're going to make enough to have an industry, like the Book of Mormon talks about, where they armed all of their armies with swords, helmets, shields, and spears, and stuff like that.
Breastplates and helmets and everything.
Yeah. And the fact is we've never found any slag pits where iron or steel has been smelted in the
Now explain to us why that's a big deal, because when you were telling me that, I didn't really catch the significance of that until you expressed that to me. This is really big. So take a moment, and why is it such a big deal that there are no slag heaps across the Americas?
Well, when I was younger, I worked for a Kennecott in Arizona, and the Kennecott smelter was down in a place called Hayden. And at nighttime, if I drive around this hill a certain time, they're dumping the slag from the smelter. and that's like volcanic rock. It hardens hard, and it has all the flavors of the stuff that it was smelted with. But slag is just the liquid rock, and the ore, that comes from the ore, and then when the ore separates and they pour it into different parts from the furnace, they keep the slag and they bring it out. When they pour it, it's all red hot, and I could watch it just running down the hill. Mm-hmm. But at the time when I'd pass, it was, and they'd been using that slag pit for who knows how long, maybe 100 years. But the thing is, slag doesn't deteriorate. It never deteriorates. It's stone. So they have never found a slag pit with iron or steel.
Yeah. And so because that they don't rot, they can't come up, an apologist can't tell us, I mean, justifiably anyway, that, oh, well, the weather wore them down and out, or they washed away in the elements or whatever. That's not what slag heaps do.
No, a slag.
And if they have that big in industry, these heaps can be hundreds of feet high.
Oh, yeah, especially around Pittsburgh. Can you imagine? Indiana? Yeah. And they had, but one thing that slag must have been good for is to make highways or to cover roads, to put gravel on the old dirt roads.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yep.
So anyway, that was one of the things that I had to study just recently. Again, I knew all of that stuff, but I wanted to try to put it together. And so all I'm saying is, if I need to know something, I'm so grateful for my computer, and I'm so grateful for my books, because I nearly died about 5 years ago. And it was my fault. I did it to myself. And they woke me up. My wife said, "To hell with that, Barry." And they sent me for the EMTs, and they took me to the hospital. And I was in a mental hospital for about 5 months.
Oh, wow.
And one of the hardest things I've ever had to learn, Gary, is to live again. To even want to live again. To even desire to live again. But there was a time, probably about 3 years after I got out of the hospital. If you've ever seen a blackout curtain, and maybe in movies you'll see it, and they'll just open it up a little bit and you see a sliver of light coming through.
Mm-hmm. And
then a little more, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's how my intelligence and my intellect came back to me, my desire to live. And all of a sudden, Gary, I got so thirsty for knowledge. Once I decided to live, I decided, as long as I'm alive, I want to live. And I want to know, and I want to study. And so that's kind of who I am.
We are kindred brothers after all. That's what I think too. It's awesome to be able to learn. I told myself when I was 11 years old, I told myself two things. Somehow I was fortunate that I started at age 11. I promised two things. One, I would never have a boring day, and I haven't. And two, I will learn something new every day, and I have. And it's been a ball. It's fun to learn, isn't it, Barry?
Well, really, it's fun to learn again, Kerry. I've always been curious. And if anybody were to say, what kind of an intellectual are you? I'd say, well, I'm a skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
Because skeptics were they were the guys who protected the other people. They were the ones who helped people get the concepts right. And when they were wrong, skeptics were
right.
kind of guides, and in Rome and Greece. So if I would be anything, I'd like to be called a skeptic. But I had to learn to live again and think again, and I've studied so much. Kerry, I'd read books in French and Spanish and Portuguese and English. But I'm losing some of that because I'm not reading as much as I used to. But I love to read and I love to learn, and I love languages and stuff like that. So it's been a nice life for me, and I just wanted to share that. I'm 81 years old. Every night I go to bed, I don't know if I'll wake up the next morning because the odds are getting less and less. But I just wanted to share a little bit about me with you, my friend, and with some of my Mormon friends, in the culture, hell, I'm a Mormon boy. You're a
Yeah.
Mormon boy. I bet everybody listening here, there might be some that never were. And, but
There are. I've got a few wonderful non-Mormons in my audience too. But yeah,
well,
we're all Mormon folk. That's the way
welcome, my friends.
it's all
I,
good.
I can say that. But I'm culturally, we were born, and the first things we learned was to pray and to talk about the church. And when I was a little boy, racism was a big thing in the church. I was born in 1941. Racism
Oh,
was a big thing in the church.
yeah, it would
And,
have been.
and the stories about why people of African ancestry couldn't have the priesthood
Yeah,
was told everywhere.
yeah.
So I had to learn, and I'm still having to learn it, to not be
Racist.
racist because
Me too. Me
I
too.
started out in a racist society. But
Yeah,
the thing about Mormon racism, it wasn't mean most of the cases. It wasn't ugly all the time, but it could get that way, and it could be that way. People would say,
had potential. Yeah.
I had a black friend while I was in graduate school tell me one time, she says, we blacks never drive Cadillacs anymore. We wouldn't be seen in a Cadillac anymore. Say now to show off, we drive BMWs and Audis and stuff like that. And she said because that was part of who people would talk about us.
Oh. Hmm.
And I thought, wow. But so having grown up in the church, I learned a lot of things that I had to finally not unlearn, but dislearn. I don't even know if that's a word, but I had to dislearn a lot of
Hey,
things.
invent the word. You are the professor. You can invent a word. Dislearn. In fact, I'll even spell it for you. Dislearn. Yes, you're welcome.
Okay, so that's my life. I'm a Mormon kid. I'm a Mormon boy. See,
Life.
I loved road shows and I loved I loved the sports leagues. I played in them. I loved the volleyball and the basketball and the softball.
Yeah.
I loved the plays I was in. I loved the people. When I was in graduate school, all I had to do when I meet new people, and it was I'd ask them, "Oh, you're from so and so," and within four generations or so, we could connect. That's how it was being a Mormon,
Yeah.
and so all you had to do, what was your mom's name or your dad's name? Uh,
Yeah.
oh, and they say, yeah, it's Johnson. I'm from Snowflake, Arizona. I go, oh, Snowflake. Do you know Raleigh? They go, yeah, he's my uncle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how it went. But that's what my society was. That's what my culture was. And if I were to say that I disliked my culture, that would be a lie. I loved it. It was who
Right.
I was. And
And
it was all,
you don't have to dislike it and become an enemy of it either.
yeah,
The crazy thing is, when I was an apologist, the philosophy, maybe it was more of a psychology than a philosophy, but if you found people who didn't believe what you believed or believe like you believed or who didn't think like you, they automatically, for whatever ridiculous reason, short-sighted reason, they automatically became suspect and a potential enemy. Ooh, oh no, be careful of Sally Smith over there, or oh, be careful of Jake Jones over there. They think different about the 10 tribes than I do.
yeah. Or they
And
don't.
it causes so much unnecessary, idiotic division with
You
people.
know, I learned one of the things I learned in the history, and you've done a good job of talking. Dan certainly done a good job of talking it. Delenn's done a good job of talking about. But when I learned that, for example, the Mormons weren't kicked out of New York. They weren't even chased out of New York. They left New York because Sidney Rigdon had a congregation over in Kirtland, Ohio, that wanted Joseph
Oh
to come
yeah,
part of them.
yeah.
So
And
Joseph
that was
was
a big boost.
completely free will. Yeah, and the group that he inherited was twice as big as the one he brought. And then uh, there were a lot of people who got gypped out of land and money in Kirtland. And
Yeah.
I'm waiting for your book to come out. So get that sucker out real fast, big guy. But anyway, Joseph was chased out of Kirtland because he had lost so much money on building the temple. And remember, he'd already built the people for the mummies. And also, he against the law, because it was against the law to start a bank in Ohio at that time.
Right.
So Joseph had made an anti-banking society.
Yep.
And they used for their cash to show you that they had reserves. They would put sand in boxes, and they would put maybe some hard metal in there in the sand or something. And then they would sprinkle the tops with 50-cent pieces.
Yeah.
And they would show people their collateral and their reserves, but there wasn't any. And so when that bank went down too, many of his own people had lost their everything. And so Joseph left in the night because he was running from the sheriff, and I think he was running from his creditors. Wherever Joseph went, he left creditors in the lurch.
Yep.
And so they got to Missouri, and the Missouri thing was not the Mormons are so good and the Missourians are so evil. It was that they were all competing for the same land, and the Mormons kept saying, well, we're not leaving. God gave us this land. You'll have to go. And what's his name? Sidney Rigdon was the first person who ever gave the, what did Boggs say? What was that order? The extermination order. Sidney Rigdon was the first person who mentioned extermination. And he's the one that said, if the Missourians don't leave us alone, we will have to exterminate them.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that caused so many headaches with the Mormons. Oh,
yeah.
That was
later, when Lilburn Boggs said it, we made him the ugly enemy.
Right.
And so it was what they did in Missouri that got them kicked into Illinois.
Yeah.
And they weren't close to being kicked out of Illinois yet. People didn't like them and people wanted them gone. But someone said, and I don't know if this is true, I appreciate Dan would know this if he'd tell me, but he said that Brigham Young was a forger and that they were forging a lot of money.
I've heard that. There's a new book out in the last couple of years on that subject. I haven't got it yet, but I will.
Evidently the law was coming after him. So, I mean, hell, he told them he was going to leave, and he said, we'll leave Nauvoo in the spring when we can have the wagons and the horses and our livestock all built up. But he left in the middle of the night, and the cold was so great that they rode their wagons from Nauvoo to, what was it, Keokuk? Anyway, just across the river. And what was a bunch of babies died that were born that night and everything. But why did he go in the middle of the night on one of the coldest nights of the year? He was running. And you know what? The one way to be safe is to have people around you.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yep. So that's about all I have to say. But when I learned this history and when I thought about all this stuff, and when I think of all the things that I believe that Joseph Smith has done, I just couldn't remain anymore. My honesty finally got the
best of it.
Yeah. I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't tell half lies.
Yeah, my in a way, I'm probably the same way. I say it just slightly differently, but I say that as an apologist, I can no longer defend the indefensible, which is more or less saying the same thing you're saying. And so, well, and that's the evolution of a person who wants to use the best part of what we have in this life, our brains, and don't let anyone else squelch our brains. Use them. Sometimes I must confess it takes courage. Sometimes it takes a lot of serious effort. It would be much easier to spend Saturday nights, every Saturday night, going out, eating on the river, having a delicious steak and lobster dinner and all. It's nice to enjoy the delectables of life, but sometimes to learn, you have to sacrifice a few of those things and get your butt in a book. A book. I tell
Well, you know, people say,
and I'm gonna get my butt in the book. Here's the book. I'm gonna put it on my chair and I'm gonna sit on it. But that's not
the reason I've been moving around so much is I got some pillows under me in my desk chair.
There you go.
I keep moving and I can't get healthy. But anyway, I was going to say, you know, if you're smart, people will say to you something like, "Well, I wish I was as smart as you."
Yeah.
And the fact is you have to make a choice. I don't mean smart, but if you're educated, because I think we're born genetically one way or another, have tendencies towards certain things. But when people would say, "I wish I knew as much about Spanish as you did," I said, "Would you like to go through the effort that I had to make?"
Yeah, exactly.
And same with, you know, I look behind you and I say, I've got a lot of books in my house, Gary, but I don't have nearly as many as you do. But I gave most of my textbooks and college books to the college. But I've read a lot of books. But that's taken a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of thinking, and that takes a lot of time.
Well, and it shows though, because now we can have absolutely awe-inspiring conversations with you because of your efforts to accumulate all the knowledge. When I'm in your age position, younger people than me is going to want to hear the same from me, and I'll keep on talking too. But that's what makes it so much fun. We have something valuable to say. I mean, look, it's worth every sacrifice. As far as, and is it a real sacrifice? It's not really. It's more of a pleasure, isn't it? Don't you find that?
Oh yeah, I was going to tell you, Kerry. When I was on my mission, I'd been on my mission about a year and a half. This is a 2.5 year mission. I had a mental breakdown. There's a lot of pressure on being on a mission, and I had this mental breakdown, and within 2 or 3 days, I was suicidal. And I kept thinking, what had happened? What's happened? What's happened? And I thought back, and I had just recently, within the last year and a half, read an article from the Journal of Discourses where Brigham Young says the spirits of the devil are all around you. Evil spirits are all around you, just waiting for you to let your guard down. Well, I'm an empiricist. I figured that's it. The reason I feel this way and I'm so afraid and everything, I must have broken the law, and God turned me over to the buffetings of Satan.
Wow.
I would like to have all of the money that I've suffered from PTSD from that incident because I was near death and I was awful. And the rest of my mission was horrible, but I stuck it out because I didn't go home and shame myself or anybody else.
Man.
But when I got home, it wasn't until about 30 years later I found out my psychologist said, "Barry, you have PTSD." I said, "How did I get that?" He said, from that incident on your mission." He said, "Yeah, you have it." He said, "This guy worked with policemen and stuff like that, where you have to diagnose PTSD because of things that happen on the job."
Well, the warfare then that gave you your PSD didn't come from an outside source. It came from all the, I guess it did, all the church teachings.
Yeah. So I've been suffering from PTSD. I still see a psychologist and a psychiatrist. I'd like to have all that money back. But one of the that really...
You can talk to me. I'll be happy to lend you an arm and the shoulder for free.
How long would one is ahead? But the fact is,
we've had a lot of good talks.
But the thing is, what I wanted to say is when I left the church and when I no longer believed in God, I no longer believed in the devil.
In the devil, there you go.
I believe there's good and evil. I really do. And I think men can choose to do it. But that was like someone dropping a chain off of my whole body was when I left the church. And I felt so free. And talk about feeling enlightened. I'm not talking about light now. I'm talking about weight.
Right. Yeah.
And so
that's fascinating.
one of the things I'm grateful for being an agnostic leaning towards atheism is that I don't have to believe in an evil spirit anymore. You know, the church would always scare me and talk about things, and then I always felt that I wasn't good enough. And one day I finally came up and I said, "To hell with it. I'm not going to the celestial kingdom. I don't like." My first temple experience was awful.
Exactly. Yeah.
I
know that terrible guilt.
I didn't like to go to the temple. I didn't like to do home teaching, but I always did. I was always faithful. But I didn't like to do so many. I didn't like genealogy, and I thought, shit, if I hear one more of these stories in church, where I kind of come feeling good and go home feeling terrible, feeling so far behind, there was a lot of pressure taken off of me when I resigned from the church, but I was already resigned that I'd be someone's servant or something like that.
Yeah. Well, Barry, this has been an absolute boatload of fun. I do appreciate you being on the show. I've always enjoyed talking to you. Barry and I talk quite a bit on the phone together, and we have all kinds of war stories we share back and forth and tell each other, hey, there's a new book in the bookstore. Go get this one or go get that one or whatever. But thank you for all the insight and inspiration and concepts. It's always fun to, part of our culture, part of our problem in our culture is we don't respect our elders like we ought to. And I'm not calling you an elder. I'm calling you.
I've heard that.
But it's always good to have the insights from someone. I mean, you've lived a rich experience full of life. You've traveled, you've gotten to speak other languages so that you've gotten to know far better than I ever will other cultures directly, which is absolutely fun to hear about. So, thank you. I hope someday in the future, and not necessarily the far future, that you'll come on my show again and we can talk again and have some more fun together. Would that be all right?
Yeah. Hey, we talked about books. I want to recommend a book.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can anybody see that turn around, but it's called The Skeptic's Annotated Bible, and it's the complete King James section, annotated by a fellow that fell out of religion one time and thought maybe we ought to know more about the Bible, and he also did one called The Skeptic's Annotated Book of Mormon, and The Skeptic's Annotated Quran, and I've read to the Book of Mormon. So anybody want to just go on your ebook and just go to Kindle, email, or ebooks.
Google it.
Yep. You can order. Yeah. Now this book is, when I bought it wasn't very expensive, but now it's over $100. But it's one of the best books I've ever learned to use as studying Christianity. And the Annotated Book of Mormon does a wonderful job of pulling the Book of Mormon apart so you can look at individual pieces, and it's super. If anybody out there wants to read a good read, well done, I recommend it.
Thank you. Good recommendation. I found another Christmas present I'm gonna get. So all right, you guys, that's it for here. We are gonna head out, and don't forget Mormonism Live on Wednesday night with Bill Reel and RFM. And then next weekend, I have Charlie Harrell. He is the author of one of the most important books to hit Mormonism in the last decade. This Is My Doctrine. We're going to be doing some very deep dives on Mormon methodology and the evolution of Mormon doctrine. So in the meantime, remember, be good, do well, have fun, work hard, sleep good, make friends, smile. It makes people wonder what you're up to. And we are out of here. Thank you again, Barry. It's been fun.
I'll get you a copy of that paper.
Oh, thank you. Yep.
Okay. Take care, man.